think this is an unfortunate start for President Obama in the region and the Middle East issue. And it looks like the next 4 years, if it continues with the same tone, will be a total failure, the end of quote. Well, for more on this, we are joined by Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for over half a century. He's written over 100 books, including Failed States, The Abuse of Power, and The Assault on Democracy. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Noam.
Glad to be with you again.
It's good to have you with us. Well, let's start off by your response to President Obama's statement and whether you think it represents a change.
It's approximately the Bush position. He began by saying that Israel, like any democracy, has a right to defend itself. That's true, but there's a gap in the reasoning. It has a right to defend itself. That doesn't follow that it has a right to defend itself by force. So we might agree, say, that the British Army and the United States in the colonies in 1776 had a right to defend itself from the terror of the George Washington's armies, which was quite real. But it didn't follow that they had a right to defend themselves by force, because they had no right to be here. So yes, they had a right to defend themselves, and they had a way to do it, namely leave. Same with the Nazis defending themselves against the terror of the partisans. They have no right to do it by force. In the case of Israel, it's exactly the same. They have a right to defend themselves, and they can easily do it. One, in a narrow sense, they could have done it by accepting the ceasefire that Hamas proposed right before the invasion. I won't go through the details. A ceasefire that had been in place and that Israel violated and broke. But in a broader sense, and this is a crucial omission in everything Obama said, and if you know who his advisors is, you understand why, Israel can defend itself by stopping its crimes. Gaza and the West Bank are a unit. Israel, with U.S. backing, is carrying out constant crimes, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, where it is moving systematically with U.S. support to take over the parts of the West Bank that it wants, and to leave Palestinians isolated in unviable cantons, Bantustans, as Sharon called them. Well, stop those crimes, and resistance to them will stop. Now, Israel has been able pretty much to stop resistance in the occupied territories, thanks in large part to the training that Obama praised by Jordan, of course, with U.S. funding and monitoring control. So yes, they've managed to, they in fact have been suppressing demonstrations, even demonstrations, peaceful demonstrations that called for support for the people of Gaza. They've carried out lots of arrests. In fact, they're a collaborationist force which supports the U.S. and Israel in their effort to take over the West Bank. Now, that's what Obama, if Israel, there's no question that all of these acts are in total violation of the foundations of international humanitarian law. Israel knows it. Their own advisors have told legal advisors have explained that to them back in '67. The World Court ruled on it. So it's all total criminality, but they want to be able to persist without any objection. And that's the thrust of Obama's remarks. Not a single word about U.S.-backed Israeli crimes, settlement, development, cantonization, a takeover in the West Bank. Rather, everyone should be quiet and let the United States and Israel continue with it. He spoke about the constructive steps of the Arab peace agreement very selectively. He said they should move forward towards normalization of relations with Israel. But that wasn't the main theme of the Arab League peace proposal. It was that there should be a two-state settlement, which the U.S. blocks. I mean, he said some words about a two-state settlement, but not where or when or how or anything else. He said nothing about the core of the problem, the U.S.-backed criminal activities, both in Gaza, which they attack at will, and crucially in the West Bank. That's the core of the problem. And you can understand it when you look at his advisors. So, say, Dennis Ross wrote an 800-page book about in which he blames Arafat for everything that's happening, barely mentions the word settlement, which was increasing steadily during the period when he was Clinton's advisor. In fact, peaked a sharp increase in Clinton's last year. Not a word about it. So the thrust of his remarks, Obama's remarks, is that Israel has a right to defend itself by force, even though it has peaceful means to defend itself. The Arabs states must move constructively to normalize relations with Israel, but very carefully omitting the main part of their proposal which is that Israel and the United States should join the overwhelming international consensus for a two-state settlement. That's missing.
Noam, we have to break. We're going to come back to this discussion. Noam Chomsky joining us from Massachusetts, a professor of linguistics, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has written many books on the Middle East. We'll be back with him in a moment. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Professor Noam Chomsky, author of many books on the Middle East. Among his books are Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy, also Hegemony or Survival. Juan?
Noam Chomsky, I'd like to ask you about the enormous civilian casualties that have shocked the entire world in this last Israeli offensive. The Israelis claim, on the one hand, that it's the unfortunate result of the Hamas hiding among the civilian population. But you've said in a recent analysis that this has been Israeli policy almost from the founding of the state, the attack on civilian populations. Could you explain?
They say so. I was just quoting the chief of staff. This is 30 years ago. And virtually no Palestinian terrorism in Israel. Virtually, he said our policy has been to attack civilians, and the reason was explained by villages, towns, and so on, and it was explained by Abba Eban, the distinguished statesman, who said, yes, that's what we've done, and we did it for a good reason. There was a rational prospect that if we attack the civilian population and cause it enough pain, they will press for what he called a cessation of hostilities. That's a euphemism, meaning cessation of resistance against Israel's takeover of the moves which were going on at the time to take over the occupied territories. So sure, if they will kill enough of them so that they'll press for quiet to permit us to continue what we're doing. Actually, Obama today didn't put it in those words, but the meaning is approximately the same. That's the meaning of his silence over the core issue of settling and takeover of the occupied territories and eliminating the possibility for any Palestinian meaningful independence, omission of this. But Eban and Gur, who I was quoting, Chief of Staff, would have also said, my heart bleeds for the civilians who are suffering, but what can we do? We have to pursue the rational prospect that if we cause them enough pain, they'll call off any opposition to our takeover of their lands and resources. But it was, I was just quoting it. They've said it very frankly. That was 30 years ago, and there's plenty more beside that.
And Obama's call to open up Gaza, to end the blockade of Gaza on the Israelis, do you see that as any kind of a meaningful turn?
It would. Those are nice words, and if he did it, that would be fine. But there's any indication that he means it. In fact, this morning on the Israel has already made it clear, stated explicitly, its foreign minister Tzipi Livni, that they're not going to live up to the ceasefire until Gaza returns to them a captured soldier. Well, that avoids the fact that Israel is far in the lead, not in capturing soldiers, but in kidnapping civilians, hijacking ships, bringing them to Israel as hostages. In fact, one day before this Israeli soldier was captured at the border, Israeli forces entered Gaza and kidnapped 2 civilians and took them to Israel, where they were hidden away in the prison system sometime. So, and in fact, according to reports I just received from Israel, I can't give you a source, they say that the radio news this morning has been reporting steadily that Amos Gilad, who's the go-between between Israel and Egypt, notified the Egyptians that Israel is not interested in a ceasefire agreement, but rather on an arrangement to stop the missiles and to free Gilad Shalit. Okay, I presume that'll be in the newspapers later. So yes, it's nice to say let's open the borders, but not avoiding the conditions that are imposed. In fact, not even mentioning the fact that the borders have been closed for years because the United States has backed Israeli closure of them. And again, his main point, which he started with, Israel, like any democracy, has a right to defend itself. That is true, but deceitful, because it has a right to defend itself, but not by force, especially when there are peaceful options that are completely open, the narrow one being a ceasefire, which the U.S. and Israel would observe for the first time, and the second, and the deeper one, by ending the crimes in the occupied territories.
Noam Chomsky, the timing of all of this. Can you talk about Election Day here in the United States, November 4th, what exactly happened there? And then the fact that it went from Election Day to 3 days before the inauguration of Barack Obama, Israel's announcement of a unilateral ceasefire.
On Election Day, November 4th, Israel violently violated a ceasefire that had held pretty well. In fact, a sharp reduction in rockets, probably not even from Hamas. It had been established that it was June or July. On November 4th, Election Day, presumably because the attention was shifted elsewhere, Israeli forces entered Gaza, killed half a dozen what they call militants, and the pretext was they found a tunnel in Gaza. Well, from a military point of view, that's an absurdity. If there was a tunnel, and if it ever reached the Israeli border, they'd stop it right there. So this was obviously just a way to break the ceasefire, kill a couple of Hamas militants, and ensure that the conflict could go on. As for the bombing, it was very carefully timed. And in fact, they've told us this. They've told us it was meticulously timed for months before the invasion. Every target selected, timing, everything. It began on a Saturday, timed at right before noon, when children were leaving schools, people milling in the streets of the densely populated city, perhaps the most densely in the world. That's when it began. They killed a couple hundred people in the first few minutes, and it ended. It was timed to end right before the inauguration. Now, presumably the reason was Obama had kept silent about the atrocities and the killing was a whole horrible story, which you can see on Al Jazeera, even little bits of it here. He'd kept silent on the pretext that there's only one president. Well, on Inauguration Day, that goes. There's a new president. And Israel surely wanted to make it to ensure that he would not be in a position where he would have to say something about the ongoing atrocities. So they terminated it, probably temporarily, right before the inauguration, and then he could go on with what we heard today.
Noam Chomsky, I want to turn for a second to George Mitchell, who President Obama has tapped as the special envoy to the Middle East. Mitchell is the retired Senate Majority Leader, best known for helping to broker Northern Ireland's landmark Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which ended decades of bloody conflict. In 2000, Mitchell was appointed by former President Bill Clinton to head a committee investigating ongoing Israeli-Palestinian violence. Saleh Meridor, Israel's ambassador to Washington, welcomed Obama's appointment of Mitchell, saying Israel holds him in, quote, high regard. This is some of what George Mitchell had to say yesterday.
The Secretary of State have just talked about our long-term objective, and the President himself has said that his administration, and I quote, will make a sustained push working with Israelis and Palestinians to achieve the goal of two states, a Jewish state in Israel and a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security. This effort must be determined, persevering, and patient. It must be backed up by political capital, economic resources, and focused attention at the highest levels of our government. And it must be firmly rooted in a shared vision of a peaceful future by the people who live in the region. At the direction of the President and the Secretary of State, and in pursuit of the President's policies, I pledge my full effort in the search for peace and stability in the Middle East.
Obama's new Middle East envoy, former Senator George Mitchell. Noam Chomsky, your response.
In Ireland, Mitchell did quite a commendable job, but notice that in Ireland there was an objective, and he helped realize that objective. Peaceful reconciliation. Britain took into account for the first time the grievances of the population, and the terror stopped, okay? And the terror was quite real. In Israel, again, you have to look at what he avoided. He says, yes, we want to have a Palestinian state. Where? Okay. He said not a word about lots of pleasantries about everyone should live in peace and so on. But where's the Palestinian state? Nothing said about the U.S.-backed actions continuing every day, which are undermining any possibility for a viable Palestinian state. The takeover of the territory, the annexation wall, which is what it is, the takeover of the Jordan Valley, the salients that cut through the West Bank and effectively trisected, the hundreds of mostly arbitrary checkpoints designed to make Palestinian life impossible, all going on, not a word about them. So, okay, we can have, in fact, the first Israeli government to talk about a Palestinian state, to even mention the words, was the ultra-right-wing Netanyahu government that came in 1996. They were asked could Palestinians have a state? Paris, who preceded them, said no, never. And Netanyahu's spokesman said, yeah, the fragments of territory that we leave to them, they can call it a state if they want, or they can call it fried chicken. Well, that's basically the attitude. And Mitchell had nothing to say about it. He carefully avoided what he knows for certain is the core problem, the illegal, totally illegal, the criminal U.S.-backed actions, which are systematically taking over the West Bank, just as they did under Clinton, and are undermining the possibility for a viable state.
Noam Chomsky, for Americans who want to figure out how to move now with the new Obama administration to end these atrocities that are occurring in the Middle East, what do you suggest? And also, what's your viewpoint of the divestment movement? Many young people are urging something similar to South Africa to begin pressing increasingly for divestment from Israel.
The position that people who are interested in peace ought to take is very straightforward. I mean, a majority of the American population, considerable majority, already agree with the full Arab League peace plan, not the little sliver of it that Obama mentioned. The peace plan calls for a two-state settlement on the international border, maybe with minor modifications. That's overwhelming international consensus. The Hamas supports it. Iran has said, they'll go along with.
No, we only have 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay, so we should push for that. Is divestment a proper tactic? Well, if you look back at South Africa, divestment became a proper tactic after years, decades of education and organizing, to the point where Congress was legislating against trade, corporations were pulling out, and so on. That's what's missing, the education and organizing, which makes it an understandable move. And in fact, if we ever got to that point, you wouldn't even need it, because the U.S. could be brought in line with international opinion.
Noam Chomsky, we want to thank you very much for being with us, and from all of us at Democracy Now!, condolences on the death of Carol, of your wife of more than half a century.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noam. Noam Chomsky, professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.